Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith takes a look at corn and soybean markets. Temple Grandin gives her thoughts on animal welfare and communicating with consumers. Tina Barrett explains changes to capital gains and the alternative minimum tax. Rick Grasby will briefly discuss winter calving, and we'll tell you about the Soybean Management Field Days research updates. Roy Smith is our marketing analyst this week. We talked with Roy Wednesday afternoon about the demand for corn, rationing in soybeans, and his thoughts leading up to and following last Friday's USDA reports.
There was a lot of discussion going into the report. Some people were just sure they were going to be bullish, and some people were sure they were going to be bearish. And myself, I was on the bullish side, and this time I happened to be right, and the reports came out showing fewer bushels of carryover than what the trade was anticipating, and so we got a positive response.
What was it looking like locally? You said locally it seemed like they wanted corn, they wanted beans, they wanted it before the report.
Before the report, there was a real interesting move in the basis pattern. The local basis here at Midwest Co-op was 20 under January futures on soybeans, and it was even money on corn. And in fact, on the corn, there was a bit of a premium in the basis if you wanted to deliver it in April or May, which is around here, that's just unheard of. At one point, all of the terminals, Council Bluffs, Blair, and so forth, had positive basis on corn and beans both.
Where do you stand on corn right now? The ethanol numbers are not great. We know there's going to be fewer livestock, and exports are fairly non-existent at this point, but do you still remain bullish?
Well, at this point I am, and that's borne out in the results of the government crop report. People were anticipating that it was going to show a lot more demand destruction than it did, and so now the response to that by the trade is that you know, they bid up the price to try to get some demand rationing, and you know, how long will it last? You know, the next report is 8th of March. So the fundamentals aren't going to change. The only thing that might change would be if they got the price high enough that the trade anticipated that there was some demand destruction going on, and that's going to be a tough call. And you know, we probably got time for a lot of things to happen between now and then.
So selling strategy-wise, are you just looking at, you know, break even, trying to determine where you're happy at?
I've had calls from farmers that say, okay, what do I do now? Corn's up 30 cents or corn's up 40 cents. Cash corn here locally is around 7 1/4. Some of the ethanol plants are bidding 7.50 or a little better. And if that makes you a profit, which I assume for most people, if they had a good crop, that would be pretty profitable. I can't honestly tell you not to do it, because 7.50 corn a year in and year out has been kind of dreamland, and it's not a bad idea to take some profits home when they're offered.
Beans didn't react quite as favorably the day of the reports on Friday, and it seems like all the news we get out of South America is good news. How do you look at that going forward?
Well, there have been some issues weather-wise early on. Some places too wet, some places too dry, which on average is average, you know. So the South American crop is having an influence on this country's crop already, because March futures are below January and May futures are below March, so the trade is bidding that South American crop into the price already. And I'd say I would be a little less tolerant of storing soybeans than I am of corn, simply from the fact that that South American crop is going to be available.
There's just too much risk, you think?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, 1350 cash beans, there's no question that there's some downside risk. Now, right now, no, not very much, you know, the middle of January. But if you're looking at April or May, yeah, there sure is some risk if the South American crop happens to be bigger than what they anticipate.
In soybeans, do you still think there's demand rationing that needs to happen as we go closer to planting here in the U.S.?
People who analyze supply and demand say yes, there still needs to be some demand rationing. I'm not an economist. I think a lot of times the market is affected more by psychology than it is by supply and demand, but there's no question that we have very tight stocks in soybeans and corn both, and somewhere along the line something's going to have to happen, because we can't come up at the end of the year with a negative number in terms of supply.
I know this area of the country is a little bit different because you don't have a lot of irrigation around here, but as you start to think about, or as other people start to think about pricing for the 2013 crop, what are the things to keep in mind?
I think you have two completely different scenarios there. First of all, this is non-irrigated country here in Cass County. The soil moisture levels are not too bad right on top, but extremely dry when you go down lower. It's going to be tough for anybody who farms in this area to do much forward pricing, because there's just too much yield risk, and there's too big a discount. If you look at the November soybeans, subtract off what is being offered for basis, that puts the price pretty low in relation to probably what your costs are going to be. If you're an irrigated farmer and you have relatively good supply of water and relatively even yields, you can lock in some prices that would be attractive in relation to historic yields. Now, attractive in relation to what we had last summer, probably not, but your costs with irrigation are a lot greater also, and that has to be plugged into the formula.
Quickly on planting, do you expect to see a lot of corn acres, at least around this area?
The area where I farm is pretty much mostly 50-50 corn and beans, very little acreage shift, simply because there's a tremendous yield drag with second year corn where there's no irrigation. I mean, you're talking in some cases 50 bushels or more yield drag, and we saw that in 2012, and the chances of any farmer planting more than a few acres of corn back on corn are very slim.
Next week, we'll talk with Mike Briggs and get his thoughts on the cattle markets. Tom Vilsack will remain as Agricultural Secretary during Barack Obama's second presidential term. The announcement came this week as the president continues to arrange his cabinet members. Vilsack also spoke Tuesday to the American Farm Bureau Federation in Nashville, calling again for a new 5-year farm bill and urging support for Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense because of his rural background and backing of biofuels. Later in the week, the USDA announced its new microloan program designed to help small operators secure loans of less than $35,000. The agency says the application process will be less complicated and feature an interest rate, which would change monthly and currently stands at 1.25%. Interested producers can contact their local Farm Service Agency office. In 2010, Temple Grandin was named to Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People list of that year. Born with autism, Grandin now serves as a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. On Tuesday, she was the 9th speaker of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Heuermann Lecture Series. Market Journal's Kurtis Harms reports on Grandin's work in reducing livestock stress and handling and how the industry can effectively communicate with consumers.
Cattle handling was terrible. Absolutely terrible.
Temple Grandin isn't your typical animal scientist. Through her autism, Grandin is able to gain a unique insight into the minds of animals. This knowledge enables her to develop strategies to effectively reduce stress in livestock. Her interest in animal welfare began in the 1970s. Back then, the industry looked a lot different than it does now.
Cattle handling in the 70s was absolutely beyond awful, and cattle handling today is so much better. People have recognized the value of good animal handling, and there's a lot of emphasis today on low-stress handling, and I think that's really a good thing.
Grandin credits much of the improvements in cattle handling to proper education and awareness.
There's been a lot of emphasis put on improving handling. Handling, I would say, is the bright spot. There's still people doing some bad things, like yanking ear tags out of cattle without cutting them first. Unfortunately, somebody in 2012 was caught doing that. That's not okay. But I would say for the most part, handling of cattle, especially in feed yards, and I think on ranches too, people are much more aware of good handling, and that's the bright spot. And the most important thing is keeping them calm. Give them a non-slip floor to stand on, no yelling and screaming. Just doing those two things will make a big difference.
Despite the improvements made in livestock handling, Grandin believes there's room for improvement in animal welfare. Mud, for example, can cause health problems in cattle and can be avoided by developing proper drainage channels. Heat stress is another aspect of the livestock industry that can be improved.
Well, we're raising cattle to bigger weights. People have got to be very careful with beta agonists so that we don't have a problem. And I'm a big believer in using outcome measures. Open mouth panting in cattle when they're at rest in the pen is not acceptable, and you're going to have to take steps to, reduce the heat stress. Larger animals have a more difficult time dissipating the heat.
When it comes to slaughtering plants, Grandin says the United States is doing well in reducing stress in livestock. She says it's important to use outcome measures and record factors such as first shot stunning rates and vocalization scores.
Let's look at outcome measures for handling at the slaughter plant. How many cattle did you stun on the first shot? How many cattle were mooing and bellowing their head off at the slaughter plant? How many animals slipped and fall? When I first started, you might have 5 or 6% of the cattle slipping and falling. Oh, now you got 1 in 2,000 that's falling. There's been a lot of improvements.
Outcome measures can also be used in a ranch or feed yard operation to document factors such as electric prod scores, vocalization, speed, and falling scores. Grandin says the regular scoring of livestock handling can lead to improvements.
Well, I like things that we can measure because let's say, the thing I have found with handling, and I've been involved in this for years, I've gone out and we get a new corral or new system in a plant, all started up, and everything's wonderful, and I come back a year later and the handling has slipped back bad. That's because people weren't measuring it, and they didn't realize. The prod was gradually coming out, more and more, but you measure it, then you can go, well, my prod score went from 2% to 10%, that's not so good. And there's an occasional animal that won't go in that squeeze chute where you might need to use the prod, but then put it away.
Overall, Grandin says livestock handling has improved dramatically over the last few years, and it's important for the industry to communicate positive practices to consumers.
We need to show what we do. And I've taken a lot of people on tours through large meatpacking plants, and they're kind of amazed how quietly the cattle walk up the chute. This is something where there's really been big improvements, but the problem is people don't know about it. Let's look at things that ranchers here in Nebraska could do. Why don't you make videos of just taking care of calves or, going out and checking on cattle, fixing fences. Because the thing is, what's chores to you is interesting to people in the cities.
For more on Grandin's research relating to animal handling, visit her website at grandin.com. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Kurtis Harms.
In addition to Grandin's website, you can also learn more by viewing her full presentation at heuermannlectures.unl.edu. A Nebraska farmer has taken over the helm of the National Renewable Energy Organization 25 by 25 Alliance. In the January Nebraska Farmer, you can read about Bart Ruth, who will co-chair the organization, which has been endorsed by nearly 1,000 partners. The 25 by 25 Alliance was created in 2004 and has a goal of getting 25% of U.S. energy from renewable resources by the year 2025. Ruth is a past president of the American Soybean Association and was named an Eisenhower Fellow for Agriculture in 2005. You can read more about Ruth and the 25 by 25 Alliance in the January Nebraska Farmer. In August, we reported from the David City location of the 2012 Soybean Management Field Days. 4 sites across the state allowed producers the chance to see ongoing and updated research. Presenters at each place discuss increasing soybean yield, seed treatments and foliar applications, and carrier rate of herbicide. They also raised soybeans and conducted their own studies in 4 different growing regions of Nebraska. At the end of January, you'll have a chance to see how those fields were affected by different treatments in the Soybean Management Field Days research updates. UNL Extension educator Keith Glewen says he hopes producers will come not only to learn the results, but also to share their concerns with researchers.
What we'd like to obtain or achieve at these 4 sites is a dialogue with growers. We learn a lot from growers just because of that, and we need to find out what their challenges are, what works for them, and also what challenges they face in trying to enhance those soybean yields, because you know, we've got 9 billion people to feed here within the next 50 years on this planet, and protein is going to be a really important part of that, and that's something, of course, the soybean can provide is a great source of protein. So a great dialogue with the faculty, the researchers that are conducting these important studies.
The research updates will be held at 4 locations in the state, in O'Neill on January 29th, Lexington on January 30th, and in both Columbus and David City on January 31st. We'll link to a program guide on our website, and you can RSVP to the Nebraska Soybean Board, UNL Extension, or the host county Extension office. You heard last week how a fiscal cliff deal would affect depreciation and payroll tax. This week, in our second of a 3-part tax series with Tina Barrett, we'll look at changes to capital gains and the alternative minimum tax. Because of modifications, we'll see differences in individual income taxes as well.
So that was what got the most publicity by far, was what we were going to do with these income tax rates. And so basically, if your taxable income is under $400,000 single or $450 married filing joint, nothing's going to happen to your income tax rates. If you're going to be over that, then it's going to be 39.6%. And that's up from 35. So it's not a huge percentage difference, but it is a little bit more if your income's up there.
The capital gains, those are going to change as well. There are going to be different rates here. I'll let you explain the numbers.
Exactly.
You're much better than I am.
So for the last few years, we've had a 0% tax rate and a 15%. So if your income fell in that 10 or 15% bracket, you qualified for the 0% capital gains. If it was over that, it was a maximum of 15%. So the other thing that they did was if you were over that 400 or 450 mark, then they put it up to 20%. So again, if you're high income, your capital gains are going to go up a little bit to 20%. So we've got a little bit there. So, and capital gains is a big deal because we're not only talking about farmland sales, but dividends from corporations, from family corporations, which are also taxed as capital gains, now a permanent thing, which was going to expire, going to be stuck there. So, if we got a C corporation with income and your personal income's low, we still got that 0% tax rate.
We're essentially adding categories to it or brackets to it with this?
Yeah, so they basically, with what the fiscal cliff law did was add another bracket, another change. And for like the single individuals, it left the 35% bracket, like at $2,500 is all that 35% bracket covers now. So it's just added a whole nother level. But there is more complication to that. Of course, we can't not have more complication. Right. Because the health care bill also added an additional tax that's coming into play in 2013. So you need the 400 and 450 is one mark, but that health care bill adds an additional tax if anybody's over more than $250,000.
And what's that tax?
So there's 2 actually. It's an additional Medicare tax, and they're taking a 3.8% tax on your unearned income, which might be interest. It's going to get those dividends. It could potentially get land sales. There's some issues there. If it's an active farmer, we're pretty sure that's not going to, but if you're a landlord, it could potentially be added to that. Rental income is another unearned income. All those are going to have an additional 3.8% tax on it. And then the other one is a 0.9%. It's a small one. Basically what it does is bring the Medicare portion of your self-employment taxes up to 3.8. And that's on any earned income, so your wages, your farm income, any other business income.
I want to step back for just a second here to the individual. They are going to pay an extra 2% a year. Is that correct on the income tax?
Okay, well, that's a Social Security tax issue, so there's another change there. But your self-employment taxes are going to go from 13.3 back up to 15.3, and wage earners are going to see that 2% come through in greater withholdings in their tax bill, and that's an expiration of the payroll tax holiday. So lots of changes to the tax rates this year, and it's going to feel a little different. Lots of small changes, but they could add up.
The alternative minimum tax, it's becoming more progressive. Is that correct? They're going to make it permanent?
Right. So
or inflation permanent?
Yeah. So what happened is the alternative minimum tax is a law that came into play back in 1969, and because there was, I think, 155 taxpayers who had gotten out of paying taxes by taking legitimate deductions, and they wanted to make sure that didn't happen. And so, but what they didn't do was index that for inflation. So we've run into this problem similar to what we ran into with the estate tax, where inflation caught up with their number. And so for the last several years, we've having these 2-year patches for AMT. And they actually fixed it permanently this year and with a high index and indexed it for inflation. So it's still going to affect people, and high income people are still going to be faced with it, but it shouldn't affect that middle ground range that we were talking. It was going to start affecting people that were making about $50,000. So they were certainly not wanting it to affect them.
Once again, you're looking at the higher end.
Yes, yeah, it's going to be. And again, it's going to, anytime you take extra deductions such as state income taxes, or a few of those kinds of things that will kick it in. So
again, for a more in-depth look at the changes, you can visit the Nebraska Farm Business website at nfbi.net or read Tina's article on the Crop Watch website. Next week, we'll have our final installment on tax changes as Tina explains new rules to the estate tax. A quick update to our recent interview with Nebraska Department of Ag Director Greg Ibaugh. Greg joined us at the beginning of the year to discuss his recent trip to China with the Paulson Institute. Part of the gathering was to show how China could invest in some sort of manufacturing sector here in the United States. The man behind that institute, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, has now been added to the list of speakers at the 25th Annual Govs AG Conference in Kearney on February 13th. For more information on registering for the conference and to see the schedule for the other speakers at the two-day event, you can visit agr.ne.gov. UNL Extension beef specialist Rick Rasby says some cow herds have started calving, with more to come as we approach March. But weather conditions in Nebraska over the last year have added management considerations for those producers.
We've been through that drought, and we're probably struggling with forages and that kind of thing, that you want to pay attention to the first calf heifer because she still needs a high-quality diet. And so from her standpoint, especially after calving, I think we do a pretty good job on the protein side of things, but boy, on the energy side of things, we have to really make sure that we meet that energy requirement. And when her energy requirement from a TDN standpoint, it'll be above 60%. So you're not going to be able to put two forages together, especially like some grass hay or even alfalfa grass hay combinations, because they won't meet that TDN requirement. So in that case, you're going to have to take a look at something like corn, distillers grains. I know there was a lot of silage put up. Some drought-damaged silage would work well in those diets, but it's just not going to be grass hay and alfalfa. You're going to have to put some other type of higher energy source in that diet to meet that TDN requirement.
UNL Extension experts will offer one more beef short course broadcast on NET2 Thursday, January 24th at 7 p.m. Central Time. Rasby and Richard Randall have already taped a discussion on calving management. That's available online at beef.unl.edu. After a dry week across most of the state, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher with his latest weather forecast.
Well, folks, here we are again. It's time for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main outlook, let's take a retrospective look at what's happened during this last 7-day period. Of course, last weekend we've seen the Arctic air infiltrate our region, and we've seen some very cold weather develop during that Saturday through the Tuesday time frame. And as you were in western Nebraska, we started to see the warm air move into the region in the Tuesday time frame, and that overspread much of the state as we got well into the Wednesday time frame, with temperatures moving well above normal. But if you look at the average for the whole week, we were very close to normal, just exceptionally cold and then exceptionally warm. Unfortunately, as we got into Thursday morning, we did see some fog set up over eastern Nebraska, and we did create a lot of black ice conditions during the early morning as temperatures were hovering in the upper 20s to near the freezing mark. Anytime we get these type of conditions where we have a warm front with very warm air moving in from the south over a very cold surface, we're going to get fog developing, and unfortunately, as those temperatures are close to freezing, we get sort of an ice fog type situation, and that's what creates black ice in many circumstances. So as we go forward in time, one of the things that we need to pay attention to as we get closer to the warmer part of the year is that these conditions do develop quite frequently, and to be aware that if your temperatures are below freezing and you have fog, most likely your surfaces are going to be very icy until the sun comes up and can burn it off. Now, in regards as we look into the future, it doesn't appear that we're going to see any significant moisture move into our region for at least the next 7 to 10 days, and we're going to be battling this off and on, again, cold to warm cycle. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see how this is going to play out. And as we go to the upper air models, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is here is the upper air low that is expected to intensify over the Great Lakes as we move through the first 3 or 4 days of this period. And that's going to draw a lot of cold air into our region. So for today, most of our high temperatures across the state are going to be set during the first half of the day. And as we get into this afternoon, much cooler air is going to start filtering into the region. And we'll see a gradual steady temperatures to slightly dropping temperatures as we progress to the evening. We may see a few clouds and maybe a scattered flurry up in northeastern Nebraska, but for overall we're not expecting a lot of precipitation. Now as we get to tomorrow, we're going to start to see some colder air filtering in, and this is going to drop our temperatures a little bit more, and a reinforcing shot of cold air looks like it's going to come behind it as we get into late Sunday into early Monday. So by the time we get to Monday, you'll notice that we get some pretty significant cold air that's going to be funneling across especially the eastern half of the state. And as we get into Tuesday, what you're going to notice is that trough starts to work its way toward the northeast, and we start to see this ridging pattern build into our region. And by the time we get to Wednesday, you're going to see that it comes ever closer to Nebraska, and very warm air is going to start moving into our region. And that trend looks to continue as we get into the Thursday, although it does flatten out some. We'll be paying attention to this cold front that might be moving through on the surface sometime late Thursday to sometime late Friday. Right now, the models do bring this through sometime during the Friday time period, but it could be a little bit quicker. So we should see some warm temperatures on Thursday, and by the time we get to Friday, here comes that energy. So this would be our best chance for some accumulating snowfall, and most likely to be concentrated in northeastern Nebraska. Otherwise, we'd expect sort of flurry activity. So in terms of the main temperature forecast, you'll notice that we see a downward slide in our temperatures, just a slight chance of flurries both Sunday night and into Tuesday. This would be across northeastern Nebraska. Then we start the general warm-up trend where we start to drop into the 50s and 60s, or excuse me, the upper 50s, and then we see that big slide down on Friday with another Arctic front coming in. Now in terms of 8 to 14 day forecast, we do see the consistency of that below normal temperatures to our northwest, warm to our southeast. We do see an increased precipitation to our east. Now, in terms of the new 30-day forecast for the month of February, we do see a colder signature to our north. In terms of precipitation, we keep the dry to our southwest.
Thanks, Sal. Our interviews with Roy Smith, Temple Grandin, and Tina Barrett are archived on the Market Journal website and on the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our marketing analyst, and we'll look at modifications to the estate tax. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.